Hello, everyone. I'm Janet Salmons, Research Community Manager for Sage MethodSpace, and I'm pleased to be joined today by Julianne Cheek and Elise Obi. We're going to talk about research design. But first, if you're new to MethodSpace, this is a blog sponsored by Sage Publishing. We're interested in everything to do with designing, conducting research, writing about it, sharing results in all different kinds of ways. And you can see at the heart of this diagram, we have teaching and learning, because we think that whether you are a brand new researcher or a very experienced researcher, we all have something to learn. And that's one of the reasons why I enjoy having these conversations, because I always learn something. So why don't you begin by just briefly introducing yourselves?
Hi, I'm Julianne Cheek. I'm a professor that works at the University College in Norway, Østfold University College. But more importantly, I think in terms of this podcast, I'm both a researcher and an educator. I'm somebody who's done research over many decades, attracted funding for research, publications, and so forth, but finds that students, for whatever reason, really struggle with the concept of research design. So that's from the point of view that I'm joining the podcast today.
Yep. Hello, my name is Elise Obi. I'm Norwegian. I work in Norway, Christiania University College. I used to work at Østfold University College, and then I was a colleague with Julianne. My PhD is in mathematics, and then I was interested in social science, and I started reading and studying that. So my background is like in double, and that's my entry point into the topic of designing research for social science students and social science type studies.
And of course, you're co-authors of this new book on research design. I really like the way that you described your experience as research faculty and your work with students, as well as your own research and writing. I think, when I'm writing about research, I always think about my students and just trying to explain things in clear ways that will help them to move forward. And I think you've taken that on with this approach. So let's just begin kind of at the beginning. So, what are we talking about when we use the term research design?
Shall I start?
Yep.
Yeah. Well, research design is a term that's gone missing a bit in many textbooks and discussions of research, particularly in courses which are getting shorter and shorter about research. And teaching of research has become almost synonymous with teaching of methods. But research design is much more than that. Research design is the intellectual framework, that surrounds the choice of methods, the whole process that is gone through when somebody is conducting research from the time they begin thinking about what problem am I interested in studying here, and why is it a problem, and what aspect of the problem do I want to study, through to, well, if that's the case, how might I go about finding out the information I'm going to need in whatever form that might be, depending on what I want to know, through to what do I do when I get the information, and then finally, how do I write up that information, and how do I locate this in the entire body of knowledge which the research is attached to. So I think research design is something much more than silo thinking that has permeated the talk and speak about research, and it's certainly antithetical or against procedures and techniques being synonymous with the conduct of research. So, and what we found was students had a lot of trouble with conceptualizing their projects in the broad scheme of things. They'd come along and tell us they were going to do a study using interviews, and that was what they thought a research design was. But of course, it's only part of it, and it can only be decided once they knew the other components that sit around that.
Yes, I agree. It's the bigger picture, and methods is a part of the design, but the research design, it's much more than methods. And we've found it hard to find literature on that. And so I think that a book on that is needed.
I think, you know, if we sum it up with all of what we've said so far, Janet, it would be that research design is adding things like an and why question to every decision that you make when you are doing your research, or even before that, when you are thinking about doing your research. It's too late when you're actually doing it. Okay, you do continue that thinking, but that thinking has to start. Why? And why do I want to do this? And why would I need to know this? And why would I need that type of information and not this? And why might a hypothesis help me get that? Or why won't a hypothesis help me get that? And then if I do it this way, what sort of analyses will I need to do? And are they consistent and congruent in giving us a cohesive, systematic approach to this research? Because what we also find is that in some of the writing by academics and researchers, there are often mismatches between this is the question I want to address in this, or this is the problem I want to address, and now I'm going to use this approach to do it. You know, and yet the approach doesn't seem to be the one to answer the question. And then people tell us, oh, I'm going to use that approach because I thought that in research, everyone had to do research in that way. So it's putting the focus on the thinking that underpins the research process at every single point.
Yeah, I like the emphasis on the design thinking and, you know, asking those questions at the beginning, you know, rather than jumping to the, well, how am I going to do it? Well, why are you doing it in the first place? You know, what's the source of that motivation? And, you know, how do you really determine whether it's a worthwhile project to study? Does it merit this kind of disciplined inquiry? And looking at it as, you know, I mean, I think about, say, design writ large outside of research. We think about, you know, something that is creative and innovative, and it's going to bring in a variety of angles or perspectives, or even, you know, kind of, you think visual design, you know, different kinds of elements. And, you know, it's not just a linear, you know, step one, step two, step three. So I think, you know, emphasizing that is really valuable, especially for new researchers. So you liken research design to a game of cards. So can you tell us about that?
Before we begin that, can we go back to one thing?
Yes, sure.
You said that, you know, an important question is why do this? You know, why is this knowledge important? And one of the aspects in research design that we haven't mentioned is the ethics, the ethical aspect of research. And research design also is much more than about just at that point, I'm going to go to an ethics committee or an IRB, you know, an institutional review board, whichever country we're situated in, they're called different things. And I'm going to ask them for this formal consent, or I'm going to develop these forms in this way, or I'm going to do that. I'm going to get ethics. To me, ethics is absolutely embedded in every part of research design and reflects the conceptual nature of research design itself. So ethics is something that we consider at every point in the book and in our thinking about research. What we're trying, research design isn't that silo thinking, and that's what's been happening a bit. It's not about qualitative or quantitative or mixed methods. They're all in there, but they're discussed in the concept of research design, if that's making sense. But I just wanted to pick up because your point was very, very good one. Yeah.
Right. And there's a lot of discussion at this point in time around the formulation of problems and the need to engage stakeholders and communities, you know, in that thinking. So, you know, I think from the beginning, when we're thinking about those ethical questions, you know, who do we need to consult? You know, what will guide us, you know, to make sure that the ways that we are approaching the study are ethically sound throughout, not just simply that a proposal is approved and then, okay, we're out there. I think about, you know, the fact that, you know, a lot of the work that a researcher does today, it's, you know, you're alone with your computer. No one is looking over your shoulder. So it's not only a matter of, say, your ethical practice, but your own integrity, as you go into this. So, I welcome your approach of, looking at these broad conceptual and ethical dynamics, as a place to start, and then, to revisit that throughout your entire process.
I think you raised sorry, Elise, just to follow this through, because I think it's a really important one. You mentioned the fact that, is this a topic that should be studied? How should it be studied? And one of the things that would be interesting to listeners, I think, is when we're put into dissertation committees context, or we're put into the context of applying for funding, which many of us have to do to earn the metrics to gain promotion or tenure or whatever else. We are forced sometimes to take on topics that perhaps aren't the ones that we think are the most important ones in a particular area, or there are others that could be done, but we conform to the topic that's set by the funder. Of course, we have to conform to the topic that's set by the funder if we want the funding, but this raises all sorts of issues even before we begin, okay, that need to be declared in terms of the ethics, that, this was part of this. The research can be designed fabulously well from that point on, but it's an incomplete tale of how that research evolved. That research evolved overtly. And, it might be using some sort of rapid technique that it's one of the debates in qualitative inquiry at the moment, the rapid approaches. We not only do we have to do well-designed research, we have to do fast research to meet, the needs of funders and so forth. So research design starts, exploding out as a concept, rather than I believe that in the past decades, we've been focusing it in, and we need to expand it out. And in so doing, we are going to do much more reliable, valid, credible, trustworthy, whatever word we want to use, depending what approach we're taking to describe the research. So this is not a free-for-all or anything goes. This is actually pretty hard, iterative, analytical work that's required. And that goes for the ethics as well. So I didn't mean to sidetrack on that, but I think the ethics and responsibility of research is something that is getting people's attention much more lately, and putting research design again into focus a bit more.
Yeah, I agree. And we put a lot of effort and attention to ethics in the book. Early in the book, we put it early in the book on purpose, and we pick up points throughout. And I think it's important, and there are different aspects of the ethical discussions throughout the book, and there's a reason for that, and that reason is exactly what Julianne is talking about now.
Yeah, and so what Elise has indicated there is that we put it throughout, we introduce it and go back to it in the book. So the book can be read and needs to be read iteratively. You don't finish chapter 1 and then we're done with chapter 1. You come back to some of the points raised in chapter 1 or chapter 2 or chapter 3 at various times as we keep building this whole notion of the research design. So that's one of the pedagogic techniques, but it's equally one of the techniques that researchers, whether they acknowledge it or not, we use it all the time. We are always reflecting back. We are always making changes, even in the most quantitative of research. We make changes, we change confidence levels, we do all sorts of things. These things are not usually talked about, yet they are very important in terms of the design and the credibility of the research.
And these are not things that a new researcher is going to learn by reading research articles, because there isn't the space in the article. It's not typically, unless it's a methodological journal, it's typically not the focus of the writing. So, we really need sources like your book and the discussion we're having to try to say, well, there's more to it. When you read an article, you're thinking, whoa, that was just kind of went smooth sailing, just like step by step, got it done. But, there's a lot more to it that is not perhaps, obvious when you're starting.
Yeah, I think my message for those of people listening who are starting is that research is extremely messy. And if it helps, I haven't ever been involved in a research project that's gone from A to Z without something happening along the way. And what needs to happen is the audit trail. declaration of what's happened along the way, how it was accounted for, what was done. That's what gives the research credibility, not cleaning it up and conveniently leaving out parts. And we see a lot of that. We see a lot of that snipping and cutting around things, inconvenient. You know, there's a whole genre about gaming of articles, of writing about gaming of articles, how we write our articles in such a way to win the desired effect, which isn't getting the research out there, it's to get it published, you know. And I think these are, you know, they are things to be aware of, but they're also things to give us heart that if we are looking at research design, it's exactly what we need to do to avoid getting ourselves in those sorts of situations. And, you know, we read up sanitized, cleaned up versions of research in most journal articles. There are some methodological journals. I'm involved in one of them as the editor-in-chief, the Qualitative Health Research Journal, for example. We take the methodological articles and we reject the ones that don't declare their research design. But what we find is that increasingly journals want shorter articles for volume, etc. And so what we're reading is a very specific genre of reporting research.
Right. So, you know, for the, you know, I want to go back to your thought about the game of cards. So, you know, how does that analogy fit? Help someone to think through these
You know,
ideas?
if you play a game of cards, that game of cards has there's a purpose to that. There's a purpose, there's something has to happen in order to win or something. And then it is that purpose that decides whether if you draw a card from the deck, then that's the purpose of the game that decides if that card is a good one or not a good one, or if it's useful to you. It depends on the cards you already hold in your hand and how it fits with those. So it's not one card that's always a good card or one card that's always a bad card. So it depends on what you already hold in your hand and what the purpose of the game is. And the same with research design. Like, it's not one method that's always a good method, or one type of research question that's always a good question. So it depends on how all of these pieces fit together. So that's what we thought about when we likened research design to a game of cards.
Right. So I think about, well, say, you know, I mean, research that involves participants in particular, whether it's qualitative or quantitative. I mean, there's an unknown there, and, you know, the ways that things unfold, just as in a game of cards, you don't know what the other players are going to do. But that, to me, is what makes it interesting. I mean, that's why research, you know, we may be making it sound like, you know, well, gee, this is a really hard thing, that's a lot of work, but it's also a great deal of fun, because, you know, it's exciting to see, like, wow, you know, what am I learning? That's, you know, perhaps, you know, opening doors that I just hadn't even thought about. So, you know, we don't want to make it, you know, so I think, you know, having the analogy of the game, it's like, well, yeah, you know, there are rules, and, you know, you've got this many players, but how the game is going to unfold, you can't tell in advance. So that's why, you know, the idea of the iterative process, not only in terms of how you approach it, but even, you know, how you might use a text like your book to, you know, say, well, wait a minute, now that this has happened, I need to rethink this part I assumed was already settled, but maybe I want to take that a little bit different direction.
And that's why in the title of the book, we called it Research Design, and then Why Thinking About Design Matters. Because, you know, without the thinking, the design is nothing. The design is just a procedure. It's just a set of steps. And that is not what research design is. And a set of steps is not going to produce excellent research. It might, but it's going to depend. And it's going to depend on the other parts of that research design. Yet many students, I mean, and one thing you said made me laugh, because one of the things that made both of us irritable, we were getting to think we were becoming old, irritable women here. Okay, me older than Elisa. Okay, but you know, people were saying, oh, why would you want to teach research? Why do you want to teach the research courses? They're the short straw. They're always the ones that, you know, are to be endured by the students. They come in and do it. It's boring. They get taught all these techniques or procedures, and then they go out and they're just glad that it's done. And we got very annoyed because we actually think that research can be fun. And that doesn't mean that it's not rigorous and credible, quite the opposite. But it doesn't have to be boring. It doesn't have to be endured. And we wanted to write a book in such a way that we hope is approachable and interesting for readers to use, and things for them to think about, so that they begin to realize why it does matter to think about these things, and why you can't go straight into collecting information from people before you know why you're collecting it and what sort of information you need to collect.
Right, right. So since you mentioned the book, let's talk a little bit about the book itself. So, you know, what are some of the key areas that you discuss in the book? You've already kind of given us a sense of the sort of big picture and iterative thinking, but, you know, tell us a little bit more about what people will find.
You can start.
Yeah. Well, what they won't find is a book that's an easy read from not that it's a difficult read, but what I mean is a sort of read that you can start in chapter 1 and go through to chapter 11, and you don't need to return to chapter 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Research is not a linear process, but a book is linear. And that was one of the things we struggled with. How do we capture that? So what we do is we overtly refer people back to concepts that we've covered in earlier chapters, and we keep building these series of iterations of thinkings, the iterative process, coming back, going on. And we try to model that, and we try to follow some threads of that right through the book. So that is one of the things that we do, so students can sort of see. And in the activities at the end of the chapters, we indicate to people, okay, here's some activities that you might want to think about. We struggled with where we put a definition of research design, because it's really hard to define. It's a process. It's all these things. It's not like a neat 2-sentence definition and then we move on. So in the first chapter, we decided that we would introduce people to some of the words that they're going to read associated with research design, build up their basic literacy in terms of that research terminology, etc. Not with definitive definitions, not at all, but sort of saying these are areas that are covered, etc. This is what this is going to look at. And the rest of the book starts unfolding that, because when we get to chapter 11, we put it all back together and we come up with a diagram and other things of what research design is, but we don't start with the diagram, because the diagram is not what research is. It's a reflection of our discussion throughout the book about what research design is. And then, as Elisa said, we start with ethics. We discuss that early on, and we make it quite clear that ethics is at all different levels throughout the research design process. We then move into the questions and problems. What sort of form can they take in research, and what does it mean if they take certain forms? Like you've done some work in that on the hypothesis, for example.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's like we discuss then in chapter 3, developing research questions, and we discuss whether when it's useful to have your research questions as hypotheses, and when you absolutely do not use hypotheses, and what happens to the whole design if you do use hypotheses as your research questions. And we pick up those points after we get into epistemology and ontology, not as like philosophy in itself, but how your view on everything impacts the whole research design process and the study itself. And then, so once we've discussed that, we hold on to that and pick up those points when we move on into discussing qualitative approaches, quantitative approaches, and not as different silos that are not, that do not have anything to do with each other, but more on emphasizing that there are a lot of the same thinking that has to be done. It's just that that thinking unfolds a bit differently once you have chosen your approach.
And that
So
I think
it sounds like it's the kind of book that you might consult when you're at that kind of beginning proposal stage, but then are going to have at hand to say, well, wait a minute, now that I have progressed it to a certain point in the, conduct of my research, new things are being revealed. I need to go back and perhaps consult this to help to clarify my thinking and the next stage of the process. I think that especially for new researchers, they kind of think, well, okay, I've done my research proposal, it's been approved, it's just kind of like, okay, I've got the map, I'm just driving down the road, like no need to, think about this again. But what you're suggesting in terms of this, really extended process throughout the conduct of the study, might mean this would be useful, something to have, at hand on your desk, not something that you file away once you've gotten your proposal approved.
Yeah, it's absolutely a book that's meant to be used, very much so. It's not a one-off read. It's something that has to be got back to, and it's designed to break down any form of, I've decided I'm going to do this because I'm told that this is the best way to do it type thinking. And there's a lot of that. And there's a lot of pressure sometimes on students to sort of think that the way that research is done, and this is better than that one. And we address that all the way through. So better is not the right word here. All right. What is the appropriate way? What is the way that is sufficient to achieve the goal of the research? So knowing the goal, or the question, and usually in outworked in forms of questions, is very important. And then after that you can make those sorts of so it's decentering methods as the only thing that matters in research design. Methods are attached to methodologies that are attached to ways of knowing. But we also don't want to get into huge philosophical discussions either, but we also want people to know that there are different views of what knowledge is and how it's produced, sufficient that then they can understand why an interview is done in the way it is in qualitative research and why an interview is done in the way that it is in more quantitative approaches. So it's always linked to the concrete. And so I think you're right. This would help people at all stages of their proposal. Remember, this book has been, or if you've in the preface, we say this book has been developed from our teaching of master students over many years, and it's all the things they've asked us. It's all the things they've struggled with, and we would talk about, why did they ask that? We thought that was very self-evident, but obviously it wasn't. So we needed to go back and think about, well, what was the thinking that we hadn't picked up that we hadn't thought to explain to them. And so, because a lot of researchers forget how much they actually know before they get to the point of going into the classroom and then giving fairly, quick overviews of things. We wanted to put back the preparation work. I would put it that way. The preparation work actually that needs to go into this before you're ready to go out and do any sort of collection of any sort of information or data.
So, it sounds like your book will be beneficial to student researchers and novice researchers, but, I would suggest that it might also be valuable to researchers who are, perhaps have had experience doing a certain type of research and now are either approaching a different kind of topic, a different kind of problem, or want to take a different methodology and set of methods, with a new study. I talk with a lot of researchers who say, for example, have been dyed-in-the-wool quantitative researchers who now, especially as the big data research becomes more available, the tools are more available for people to use, but then saying, well, we need that qualitative side to dig into the experiences behind these big things. So now I've got to learn something new, and that involves maybe thinking about the research differently. So, I would ask, as you think about, people who might benefit from this, across that spectrum, what would you hope the book can accomplish?
Well, I think Elisa pointed out that both of us have both had formal qualifications in science, and we have formal qualifications in social science, and Elisa also has formal qualifications in mathematics. That's an unusual,
Right.
because often we're siloed into one way of thinking. And what we began to realize was that we think about things differently. And that's why we had a lot in common. And it's because we have been educated and taught in those things, and we understand a little bit about the thing. We don't understand all of it, of course, nobody does, the thinking behind it. So what I would say that the book is useful for is for anyone who's thinking about, I've always done it this way, but I realize I'm missing this, your sort of statement, or I realize that that can give me so much, but now I'm really curious about how to do this. So what would I need to think about? How might I go about this? It certainly would be useful for that. And I think the other thing is a political intent of the book, and that is to break down this total division between qualitative, quantitative, and mixed methods, you know, and never shall they ever meet. Okay, they can meet in different ways without affecting the validity of the quantitative or the credibility of the qualitative. If we understand what ways they can meet, what ways they can't meet, what definitely they don't have in common, what they do have in common. And as Elisa said, the different outworkings of the thinking that sits behind them, it makes us much more considered and careful researchers, I think, when we know that. And it takes us away from just collecting data, because research isn't about collecting data. It's much, much more than that.
Right, right. And I think, you know, that kind of background also makes you a better consumer of research. So, you know, if you're, you know, someone who is only locked into one particular approach, well, how do you understand the literature in a meaningful way, you know, that is either from a different discipline or, you know, from based in a different paradigm. So is there anything else you would like to add?
About the book or
About the book or research design?
I think also it would be a useful book for people who want to use research as evidence of why they do things the way they do, like practice
Areas, very much so. It's directed.
Because it's about understanding the evidence researchers put on your table and claim to be evidence. And there are different types of research findings, different types of knowledge, different types of understanding. So what you can and cannot say based on a specific research design, and being able to understand what the findings actually mean when put into a practice field. I think that's really important. So I think a lot of people outside the research, like intense universities and that sort of environment, could also benefit from working with this book.
Yeah, I think also people who maybe work in governments and other organizations who are asked to commission research.
Right.
Often that comes as part of the role as a manager or somebody like that. You're asked to commission some research. How do you make decisions about what should be commissioned? How do you make decisions about what the problem actually is? How can you think about this in such a way that you actually achieve through that commissioning what you hope to achieve? And I think the other group of people that would find this research design book comforting to some extent is, you know, why are these polemics? Why are there so many polemics in these discussions about research and research design? Why has this happened? Why has it occurred? And how can we get around it? Well, we probably can't do much about people's polemic views. They're hard to change because they are polemic. But what we can do is show that research design, this is what it is. And within there are various approaches, and you may use you yourself may use different approaches at different times, depending what it is you're trying to do. And that is okay.
Well, thank you for taking the time to talk us through some of these, you know, ways of thinking and then your work with the book.
Hmm.
Thank you
Thank you
for
very
having
much.
us.
Yeah, thanks.